Ron, I think Ron would be good for, right?
Oh, we can get going on the information.
Okay, yeah.
Sure.
So I think we'll get going. We have a fairly full agenda. I'm Nick Page. I'm the chair of the Cove Bay Water Local Advisory Committee. The meeting this evening is basically split into two halves. The first half is really dedicated to staff presenting on the information meeting portion, and the agenda and materials associated with that are provided. So I'll be turning it over to Hayre, the Chief Financial Officer, in a moment. The second half, starting at 8, will be the regular local advisory committee meeting. That is more of a, there's more discussion obviously about committee members and more opportunity for the public to respond to that. Does anyone have any questions about how those meetings are structured or what the sort of procedures are around that? Okay, on that, I'll turn it over to Raj to start with the information updates.
Well, thanks, Nick. I'd like to welcome you all to the Cove Bay information meeting. We're going to, before we get started actually, maybe I'll just go around the table and introduce you to our staff so you know who everybody at the table is. Nick's already introduced himself, and he's the chair of the LAC meeting. Glen is our interim director of engineering, and is working on major capital projects and providing us engineering services, and he's with Urban Systems. Annette Frischman is our utilities billing clerk, and so your water bill, she has all the information pertaining to your water bill, sends out your water bills to you. Marie Skeels is our community, I guess, our resident member of the LAC.
Sure.
And past mayor of the municipality. Hope Dallas is our corporate officer. And Allison Morris is the council representative on the LAC. And we have Michael Kale sitting here, who is a resident member, but also council member.
But not a committee member.
Not a committee.
I should actually be sitting with everybody else. I just sat down where I usually sat. So apologies.
So without any further ado, maybe I'll just give you a quick overview. This isn't working.
What? It's not.
We don't have an IT guy on staff for all the meetings?
Well, yeah,
You've got a 13-year-old.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's right.
you missed the full-time IT guy there Tuesday and Wednesday.
He had homework tonight.
Oh, thanks. So.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Okay, there we go.
let me see this.
There we go.
Yeah, okay, there you go.
So before we get going, maybe I'll just give you a quick overview of what we're going to discuss this evening. We're going to go over a few quick facts and rate structure. We've got a couple of graphs that show consumption behavior in general in Cove Bay, and then I'll get into the financial report. So we'll be talking about the financial results for the previous year. We'll be reviewing the 5-year financial plan that was approved by council earlier on in the year, and then I've got a couple of slides on reserve balances and replacement costs. And then Glen will be getting into the operation side of things and talking a little bit more about the water treatment plant project as well. So in terms of, I'm actually going to let Annette talk about the rate structure and basically a few quick facts about the Cove Bay rate structure.
Yeah, thank you. Quick overview, we have about 633 actually connected homes in Cove Bay, of which 40 are commercial connections approximately. The water source comes from Grafton Lake, and the meters are read 3 times a year at the beginning of January, of May, and of September, with the water bills going out immediately after the meter readings. The flat rate per billing period is $205 or $615 annually, and that would include 34 cubic meters per month or 136 cubic meters per billing period. And for each additional cubic meter that a user would consume, it's $1.10 per bylaw. If somebody uses or a resident uses more than 136 cubic meters in a billing period, they do receive a letter from us that makes them aware of their excessive consumption, and we tell them that the reason may be a leak if they are not aware that they did use the water for gardening, a pool, or whatever else it could be. We have started recently to request everyone to submit their email addresses or phone numbers to us so that we can immediately contact the water users if we detect a leak, so that there is no delay. So far we have usually only had the mailing addresses, which usually takes some days or sometimes even up to a week until it reaches the person. If there is a substantial leak on a private property that we detect, we switch to water off at the water meter immediately, and then afterwards try to contact the homeowner as soon as possible. Yeah, I think that was everything I had for the rate structure overview.
Thanks, Annette. And then we have a couple of consumption graphs, and the idea of the reason we're providing these graphs is just to give you an idea of how water is being consumed. So this one is for the residential sector, and what this graph is essentially showing you is that the average annual consumption per residential connection is 205 meters a year, and that's an arithmetic average. So essentially, if you take a look at the green line going across is showing the average, and you can see about 360 homes are consuming below the average amount of 205 cubic meters a year, and then basically from the 360th home to about 579 homes are consuming over the average amount. And the numbers, the 391 and the 729 cubic meters of consumption are just there to provide you context at where consumption is at for those homes there. So in terms of daily consumption, that translates to about half a meter a day per residential connection. And in terms of, we've broken the consumption graphs into residential and commercial because they're two very different types of consumption behaviors taking place. So in terms of the commercial sector, I believe there were about 40 connections there, and you can see that most of those connections are using less than the average. So 32 are below the average of 1,076 meters consumed a year, and about 8 connections are above the average consumption amount. And again, these graphs are just to kind of provide you with context in terms of consumption behavior.
And just to comment on, if you were to look at use across West Vancouver, it would be very similar, that most people are below this average, and then there's a fairly limited number that are the high consumers. Very typical of water system use.
Thanks. So the next slide here is actually recapping the 2018 operating results. So we collected $446,000 in water utility fees. Parcel taxes, which was Queen Charlotte Heights. Debt servicing was, we collected $28,975 from parcel tax to service debt. Our return on investments was about $27,000 in comparison to a budget of $12,000. The reason that was quite a bit higher than the budget is we had been advanced $1.9 million in grant funds for the water treatment plant. So those funds, while they're not used, have been invested, and the investment earnings are actually going into the reserve for Cove Bay. So it's kind of a good deal for the municipality there, time being. Again, connection fees are for new connections. There were 6 connections at about $1,500 each for $9,000 of revenue. And the other revenue is actually an actuarial adjustment on the debt. So the debt amount was reduced. So what we need to do is we take the actuarial adjustment down for the Queen Charlotte Heights debt and recognize it as revenue. And you'll notice that correspondingly the debt servicing costs are about $16,000 higher as well. They kind of offset each other. but the debt went down by 16,000 more than it otherwise would have because of this actuarial adjustment. Listed the expenses down below. There was essentially, most of our expenses came in favorable to budget, and we had $181,000 contribution to the reserve, basically the capital reserve in Cove Bay, with total expenses equaling revenues of just shy of $528,000. Is there any questions on the operating results? Yes.
Did I hear right when you said the new users paid $1,500 to join?
No, it's actually a new connection. When we connect a new property, the connection fee is $1,500.
How come I paid $10,000 and then with all of the interest rate has come up to $30,000? We're
So-
still servicing that debt. How come they're only paying $1,500 and I pay so much?
I believe the 10,000 or 9 or 10,000 you're talking about is to become part of the Cove Bay Water District, so you wouldn't have been in the Cove Bay Water District.
No, sorry. Queen Charlotte Heights.
Queen-
So this is the capital cost of the improvements that went into that area as a local service area, and that's what he was just speaking about is the parcel tax, the 28,975 and the 16,900
Yes.
reduction in debt is only paid by those people
Yes.
in the Queen Charlotte Heights expansion area when that went ahead, however many years ago that was. So that's what you paid
Yeah.
for, different than the whole rest of the system.
So how is that different from the new users joining?
Well, there are lots that already exist in the system. They built a house, though it's just $1,500 to connect their meter, and their line, and all that stuff.
They're within the boundaries of the Cove Bay Water District, so
Yeah.
Cove Bay undeveloped, Kate's Hill lot that connects into pipe along the street pay that much less connection fee. So it's to do with the boundary of the.
I see, so then, tell me if I'm outside of the limits here, but when Josephine Ridge and the new division.
Josephine Ridge?
Yeah,
Josephine Ridge is on the other side of the island.
oh, well, I thought it was connected with.
No, you're trying to think of Grafton Lake.
Grafton Lake, okay, so when Grafton Lake joins, are they paying
Yes.
10,000?
Yes,
Yes.
they are.
But only 10,000, so
Per
they're
lot.
paying.
Per lot.
They're paying $10,000 per connection,
Yeah,
plus all of the costs associated with piping, pumping, connections, every
In the
every cost you can think of. Plus, they are giving us, where we are receiving from them, the land to build the treatment plant on. Okay, so this is a negotiation that was done
Yes, I
as
realize
part
that.
of their subdivision. So yes,
Their rezoning.
or their rezoning. So the $10,000 was a negotiated amount with them. It just happens to be similar, I guess,
yeah.
to what the Queen Charlotte Heights was. But it's a totally different animal altogether, okay?
Thank you. Rita.
Is that-
Is the debt paid off
That's
this year,
right.
Raj?
Thank you.
Yes, in 2009.
Yeah, so anybody in Queen Charlotte Heights, the debt's gone as of 2019,
As of the end of 2019.
the end of this year, yeah.
Finally, for a long time.
But then we're gonna have one less person show up at our annual meeting.
Put mine on the list, don't worry, Mary.
So the next slide here is recapping our 2018 capital results. So essentially, we spent $137,000 in design costs for the Cove Bay treatment plant. That was funded essentially one-third by the federal and provincial governments and the municipality. The difference between the 68 and then the funding for the Cove Bay treatment is a transfer from reserves for the Cove Bay utility share of purchasing a truck that is used to service all utilities across the island. Any questions on the capital slide before I move on? So moving ahead, the next item is our 2019 to 2023 five-year financial plan. Last year when we did the plan, we had made some assumptions, detailed assumptions were in the package there, but essentially on average, our expenditures, the assumption was the expenditures would increase by 2% a year, and the balancing number to, essentially utility is self-funded, so the balancing number was the user fees, and the user fees were going up by about, were projected to be going up by about 2% a year in the 5-year financial plan as well. When we did the financial plan last year, the debt servicing had taken into consideration information we had last year, and so it was based on the original budget of about 5.7 million for the water treatment plant, which envisioned us borrowing about $800,000 at that time. So the 5-year financial plan, we were just going to get into working on the new 5-year financial plan for 2020 to 2024, and that'll be updated in the upcoming months here. In terms of our, sorry, the top of the slide here is cut off, but this is our 5-year financial plan for Cove Bay Water System for capital, and essentially we had anticipated the water treatment plant to be completed in 2020. We're pushing that out a year now, so we anticipate that the water treatment plant will be complete in 2021, possibly early 2022. In terms of the reserve balance in Cove Bay, at the beginning of the year, we opened reserves with a balance of about $964,000. We contributed $181,400 to reserves. Interest earned on reserves was just $16,500. We used reserve funds to fund the Cove Bay water treatment plant and the vehicles I've shown in the previous slide, with $68,000, leaving us with a closing balance in reserves of about $1,093,000 at the end of last year. We've also embarked on an asset management exercise, and this slide is just to give you an idea of the infrastructure value of Cove Bay water infrastructure. The average age of the infrastructure, I believe, is about 35 years old. Most of it was installed in about 1984. The infrastructure, if we were going to replace the entire system, it would cost us about $19,200,000. Obviously, the replacement will take place in pieces, but this slide is here to give you context that the reserve balances only have about $1,093,000 in them, so they are a little bit light, and we are currently making an annual contribution of about $181,000. For new infrastructure, that contribution to reserve should be about 1% of the value of the infrastructure, and this is old infrastructure, so that contribution to reserves is, I would say at this point, is a little bit light in contrast to the age of the infrastructure, and our reserve balance is a bit light as infrastructure problems start surfacing and we have to replace that infrastructure. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Glen for the more interesting part of the presentation now.
Well, I'll try to meet anyway. Chlorine.
Sorry, we've got a question. Sorry, before we carry on, yeah, question.
On the operations of the Cove Bay water system and the utilities truck, that kind of, how do you decide how much of the municipal cost you assign? There were things like rent, there were things like training, the certificates that are in here obviously are municipal costs, and I noticed that several of the people that have certificates are no longer municipalities, so you're going to have to train new people. How do you decide how much is assigned to the Cove Bay water system as opposed to the other 6 water systems?
What we do is we allocate those shared costs we prorate them based on the number of connections in Cove Bay relative to the total number of connections on the entire island. And we had reviewed that last year, and it seems to be an equitable representation of the effort spent on servicing and maintaining those systems.
do you think that's going to be true this year when so much effort has been spent on a couple of outlying systems that have 25, 30 users? And we have 660?
Most of those costs are being tracked directly to those systems, so they're not shared costs. So if, for example, if you're referring to the problem in Blue Water Park where we're having to do repairs, those costs are charged directly to that water system. They're not a shared cost.
All right, thank you.
Okay, great. My presentation's broken into a few different segments. I'm going to start by talking about treatment, then I'll move into talking about some of the operational elements, and then finally starting to talk about the water treatment plant. So starting with treatment, as I'm sure you're all aware, the only form of treatment in the Cove system is disinfection through chlorination. That's injected into the system just downstream of Grafton Lake. In about 2004, recognizing because of the magnitude and the configuration of the system, there were challenges of maintaining chlorine residuals, so our rechlorination station further down in the system was added. Sampling is done regularly in accordance with the permit requirements and through consultation with the health officer. In general, sampling involves testing for total coliforms, E. coli, disinfection byproducts. There's two different ones. And chlorine residuals are tested at 9 different stations regularly, as well as turbidity, which is tested at the chlorination station. All are reporting quite well, with the exception of there was a hit of E. coli and coliforms on January 15th, 2018. I must apologize that we did some research into trying to find out what the specific response to that was. We don't seem to have, or at least I haven't been able to get access to the response, but the typical and required is the health authority would require retesting and also for checking of chlorine residuals, and generally if the chlorine residuals are adequate, then there's no oil water advisory, and we assume that that was the case here, as no oil water advisory was issued in 2018. Chlorine residuals, chlorine is certainly a challenge within the Cove system, and maintaining those levels. So there's, I'm sure you probably experience a swing in taste perhaps. There's certainly a desire to try to maintain chlorine residuals at 0.2 parts per million. Records indicate that they commonly have spiked up to over 2.2 parts per million, and that's typically the level that people start tasting it, and well, actually you can taste it before that, but this is the level that people generally will start complaining at the taste. There was also a number of instances where there was 0, which is not unexpected. The average far exceeds, but there are many instances where it drops off. And this is one of the challenges with the Cove system in terms of its configuration. There's many dead ends, and so there's a lack of turnover if there's no usage, as well as the turbidity problems in the organics that you experience are also a draw on chlorine. So crews certainly have an ongoing challenge with trying to maintain adequate chlorine levels.
And are those associated with the tanks or specific storage areas, or are they just associated with the low residuals? Is that associated with just like you say dead ends and low volume systems?
Yeah, it's generally not associated with the reservoirs. It's usage and circulation and the change of the other factors, the organics, which generally create the color in the water, and the turbidity introduce other elements that heat up the chlorine and give the loads. There's a couple different disinfection byproducts that Metro Van requires to be tested for. There are instances where they were higher than recommended. This isn't a major concern, but it's something Metro Vancouver wishes to test for. And again, this is largely a result of the very fluctuating chlorine levels in managing those. Getting into, is there any questions on water quality? That's my final slide on water quality statements. So just getting into a few statistics on the water distribution and storage system. It services a population. There was already talked about the number of connections, but the population is estimated at around 1,890. Annette had already indicated the approximate. It looks like we're slightly off on our numbers, but they're in the same ballpark. The supply reservoir, as you know, is Grafton Lake. There's 3 other balancing reservoirs within the system, and those are smaller manufactured reservoirs that provide balancing for both domestic use and also fire suppression. There's a total of 10 different pressure zones because of the elevation change throughout the watershed, and there's valves called pressure reducing valves or stations in between each of those pressure zones. There's also 3 booster stations to push water to higher elevations. There's quite an extensive network of water mains, 2,540 meters or 2.5 kilometers of larger diameter, 8-inch to 14-inch, and most of them are smaller. I don't think there's too many 2-inch anymore. Most of them are probably 6 to 8-inch, but there's a total of 13 kilometers of those sizes. Most of the water mains are PVC and ductile iron, but there's also some older style cast iron and asbestos cement. And PVC and ductile iron have a fairly long lifespan to them, so those should last many years yet. But cast iron and asbestos cement don't tend to have a very long life and would be older to begin with. So it's certainly something to take inventory of and give consideration. Those are likely the first ones to require some renewal. Getting into some operational items, there was no system improvements done in 2018. As standard process, there was 2 water main flushing periods. There was also 4 notices also required by health authority, notices sent out warning folks that may be immunocompromised because of the lack of filtration within the water supply. It's hard not to talk about it this year, although we are mainly talking about 2018. I'm sure you're all aware of some of the water woes that occurred in the Blue Water Bay system. Those folks were on the verge of running out of water, so we had to make an emergency decision to get them some water, and it came out of Grafton Lake. So there was about 20 tank loads of water that were supplied to King Edward Bay and Blue Water in July of this year.
Was the Cove system compensated for that, or how does that work moving forward? I guess that's the question I have too, like that water going out of our system into other systems, and if it happens again in the future, what sort of compensation is there for our system?
Yeah. Well, in this case, the water was taken upstream of any user's meters, so the water was taken out of the system, but it wasn't at anybody else's expense. So there's no cost compensation from our perspective required. It didn't compromise or wasn't done at the expense of
But at
any
what level
user's.
would there be, I mean, there'd have to be at some point, basically, if we continued to take water out of the system, and then eventually it would lead to the
for
point
sure.
of...
Oh, for sure, if it was to compromise the source, but in this case, we took 20 tanker loads.
How much is a
which,
tanker approximately?
I
cubic
think
meters?
they're probably around 8 cubic meters, I would
So
think.
160 cubic meters at
Something like that.
and the charge on overflow use would be $1, so you're talking $160 worth
Okay.
of water.
Okay, fair
So
enough.
it's probably insignificant
Right.
relative to the cost of actually.
Yeah, but I understood
Accounted
that the blue water was being fed by KEB as well, and there was compensation going there, and they ran out, right? And that's what sort of caused it too. So I guess I just had a concern that long-term, if there's problems on the island, and you're coming to our water source,
Yeah.
there has to be some sort of structure in place as
Some
opposed to
activity.
addressing it on an
We're
emergency.
certainly hoping this is a one-off instance and this isn't a recurring, but
Well, yeah,
for sure.
but there's problems for sure. Yeah.
Can I just address that for a second?
Please.
Of course,
Yeah, keep in mind, we don't own the water, right? We have the right to take the amount of water that sort of we need, but that it's very prescribed amounts under a license from the province.
Okay.
So they can give the rest of the water to anybody else they want, theoretically. There's a controller of water rights in Victoria, it's all a big deal, but the basic point here is we can't sell the water, it's not our water. We can use the water up to the limit of our licenses for our own uses.
Okay.
Okay, and if we got into a situation where that was going to be compromised by some other use, then it would be a big deal. But as it is now, upstream water can go anywhere that the province allows it to go.
we don't own the lake water basically. 'Cause
No,
we
no,
own the
any water.
system.
No, we get to use what we
We
need.
get to use what we need.
I-
A question, yeah? Go ahead.
How does that all fit into the overall concept of conservation of Grafton Lake water? If indeed other areas on the island are starting to run out of water, and they need to tap into ours, how are we gonna address that? Because that hasn't been addressed in the 2011 plan.
Yeah, I think we'll defer that to the second half of this
Okay.
meeting, if that's okay.
Okay.
So good question, but let's keep on the information meeting side.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And just one other point of clarification, King Edward Bay and Blue Water run on wells, not surface water. So it's a different legal structure.
Okay.
So this is some tests actually. I wanted to report this for interest that with some of the development taking place right here in Snud Cove, there was a need for us to better understand operating pressures and the ability to provide fire protection in this area. So 3 hydrant flow tests were done in the last couple weeks, and reporting just came in. Those tests were done in the vicinity of the Miller Road and Trunk Road intersection. The rates indicated that they're generally sufficient for a single-family residence, but they're not adequate to meet the commercial properties that are currently rated by the Fire Underwriter Survey. And so at this point, new developments in the area will need to provide in-building sprinklers and building designs that satisfy available fire flow and requirements of the Fire Underwriter Survey. Another just point that we'll talk about later is just that there are continuing to be requests for service area expansions to the Cove Bay system, and it kind of speaks to the question, and I think that is an important one moving forward, is to assess long-term the sustainability of the system and how that relates to other water systems on the island. In fact, I will be making a recommendation to council to undertake a comprehensive, essentially, water master plan assessment across the entire island for all its public systems. There's unique elements associated with every system, but it does need to be looked at comprehensively. There's a lot of continued development currently going on, as well as anticipated in the future, and also with the potential threat or the likely threat of climate change influence as well. So all of those do need to be better understood. I'm into my final section, unless anybody has further questions about operations or infrastructure, I'll get into talking about the water treatment plant. So the water treatment plant will probably be talked about a lot in the next session, but as a summary, with your very basic treatment that you currently have, we expect, or there will be, a night and day difference between what you experience today and what you'll experience after this plant. This treatment plant is to remove color, address turbidities, address elevated manganese level, adjust for pH and alkalinity as well, deal with virus inactivation and protozoa reduction, and those are parasites. And that's the bottom two there are the ones that are at risk to those who are immunocompromised. The treatment plant will have a number of components to it. In series, they start with, after it's taken out of Grafton Lake, there's a coagulation process and then flocculation to allow that to settle out in tanks. There's then a pH adjustment, and then the heart of the system is the water gets filtered through ceramic filters and then goes through ultraviolet reactors to help start the disinfection process. And the disinfection is also supported by chlorination still. And then finally, there's a storage reservoir, a new constructed storage reservoir prior to it being distributed down into the community.
And just to comment on back up one.
Yeah.
So there's these top on the treatment objectives, color and turbidity. So I think we all know it's a surface water fed system. This color and turbidity is measured as sort of the transmission of light through water. So it can have issues like in the Capilano and Seymour reservoirs, it's related to landslide risk. That's where they get the turbidity events. Ours is more related to organic load. So this kind of color that we get typically in kind of a turnover of the reservoir, late summer, early fall. Some years it's worse. Last year it was not as bad as previous years, but that's when you see it in your toilet, you see it in your sink, you put it in a glass, it's kind of that tea color. And that's obviously it's an issue unto itself, but mainly it's an issue because it gives things like viruses and protozoa a place to hide. These organic particles are reducing the effectiveness of chlorine. Chlorine is taken up by them. So things, again, a virus or protozoa or bacteria can pass through that system because in a way there's a physical sort of hiding amongst those particles that transmit it. So it's just a symptom of the kind of water we have. We are not going to change the overall reservoir. It would be very typical of coastal reservoirs to have those issues.
So where we're at in the process is the consultant who's WSP is the consultant name, just recently issued us the issued for tender is what IFT stands for, the package for our review, and so that's nearing completion. Tomorrow actually we're having a meeting with Vancouver Coastal Health. There's many issues to talk through, so we'll be meeting there at 2:30 tomorrow afternoon. It's anticipated, depending on how the review process goes, it's hoped that the tender process will begin sometime in November, and then to close and then award the contract to a contractor at the end of the year, and then getting into start of construction early in the new year. It's anticipated there's funding requirement for it to be complete by March 2021, and it does anticipate to be about a 12 to 14-month construction period. Just a final slide here, just some recommendations that I'm offering. Certainly one is to tender and build the treatment plant. given the tests that were done recently and identifying the fire flow issue right down here in the Cove, is to perhaps look at doing some greater assessment of fire flow protection across the entire system. I think Raj also talked a little bit here about the needs for asset management and developing a longer range renewal strategy given the age of the system. And fitting into the master plan recommendation that I'm making is to look at impact assessment of Grafton Lake, considering future developments and climate change. That's it for me.
Thank you. Yes, question at the back.
So on an earlier slide, you mentioned that chlorine is one of the basic elements used for purifying the water for current drinking, but chlorine will continue to be used in the new system.
Yep.
And people there's a level at which people were complaining about the chlorine usage. In the new system, will the level of chlorine be significantly reduced but still used? What's the relationship there between the old and the new system?
Yeah, the chlorine use should dramatically go down because you've got multiple layers of treatment now, and one of the challenges now is that we tend to have to use a lot more chlorine because you have no other support. This is, essentially high levels of treatment ultimately go through UV, so essentially it's fully treated and disinfected water, but there is a requirement. If it was direct to the source, you could get away without having to re-inject chlorine, but because of the time and through an extensive distribution system, chlorine does have to be used. But the usage of that should be dramatically less than what you're experiencing, and a lot more stable as well, because you're not battling those other constituents of the water.
So you're not going to be getting those spikes that we currently
Shouldn't, no.
That organic load that's driving the highest uses of chlorine will be gone, basically, with the treatment facility. Yes?
I have many questions, but I think probably the biggest one is, and I assume it's for financial reasons, why it's out for tender for more than a year. It seems to me that is adding the time, why we can't build it sooner, and why the timeline has stretched so far, how we got to this point, because I really thought we would have a treatment plant before. Now, I'm at Valterra, so every single building has treatment, a filtration system, not treatment on it. And it's quite expensive, as you might imagine, and then we're having to filter our water additionally at the sink if we have immune problems. But anyway, that one question is about why the timeline has changed, and is it that tender section? And then I would also like to know if you're putting the lines out to Grafton, if there might possibly be an opportunity for Valterra to get onto Cove Bay. It was cost prohibitive before, and I'm just wondering if the cost might change in the future.
Raj, do you want to start with the first one?
If I can talk to the delay in the tendering process, we didn't own the property that the water treatment plant is going to be built on. It was provided as an amenity contribution. So the municipality needed to take title to that property before we could continue on with awarding a tender, or even putting a tender out to, or of the tender package out.
I also understand that there was some delays associated with some redesign work. Original design and the cost was over budget, so there was some redesign work to try to reduce the costs. That resulted in some delays as well.
For example, the analysis of fire needs in Cove Bay, in the Maypark Cove Bay, changed the design of the tank that was needed at the treatment plant site to basically feed those systems. So what buildings are sprinklered or not sprinklered, what are the fire demands? So things like that, perhaps they could have been undertaken a year or 2 years ago, but they got part of that design process. So incrementally, that's what extends things as well as increases the price.
And it's typical to have it out to tender for a year.
No,
no.
that's
Says
confusion.
November,
No,
and
this
then
coming
for
November.
one whole year.
No.
but
Raj, can you go back
it
to
would be
the
awarded
10th?
till the end
No,
of, okay,
no,
I just
no.
read it.
2020, this is 2019, it's going to be awarded by like January
Oh,
20.
the
The end of,
This year.
end of so it's like a
December of
2-month
this year.
process.
Oh, thank you, that's
Yeah.
much better.
So
And the
con-
Valterra question, is there any way to speculate?
I don't know the answer to that.
I don't know, it's certainly capacity and being able to deliver. So there's two issues about expansion. One is just having adequate supply. The other one is having adequate distribution and balancing storage to meet fire protection and everything. Those are two things and that fits into the overall assessment, I believe, that needs to take place to ensure that all the system is operating sustainably.
The short answer to that is it would be hundreds of thousands of dollars for Valterra to join the system for a number of reasons. And so Valterra would have to apply with an understanding that there was a significant cost involved in it. Right, for example, the Snug Cove House people, when they wanted to join the system, they gave us a check for $400,000 to cover their share of expansion to the system, just to get it down to the Snug Cove House site. So just give, it's those sorts of numbers involved, so
Right.
we don't speculate, we get application.
I don't like to disagree with you, but isn't Valterra already part
As
of the
far
Cove
as
Bay
I
water
know,
system?
they are.
Well,
Yeah, that's what
yeah,
I'm
we're just
saying.
not on the sewer system. I guess
Oh,
that's
the
the-
sewer
Oh, no.
That's the other end.
Next
Sorry
meeting.
to conflate that. Okay.
No, wrong water.
Thank you, Rob.
Another question, not Belterra related.
No, please.
I was sitting here pretty sure, actually, I'm sorry, I remember all the discussions about Belterra long ago, and one of the issues was water, and I was
Right.
sure that Cove Bay had agreed at that point, and it was paid for. So, my question, actually has to do with some certainty. How sure, now that we're going back out looking for $2.533 million, are we sure we don't have the final plan? We haven't, done that. Do we know that's enough money? Are we gonna be back sitting here again in another 6 months saying it's gonna be even more for the 660 users of the Cove Bay water system?
No, I.
So your question, your concern is, Bill, that when the tenders results come
It's gonna
back,
be way
it's gonna
more
be a
than
higher
we
number than we thought it was
Exactly.
going to
And
be.
then what are we gonna do? Are we,
Well,
we have, right at the moment, we have an opportunity to do an approval process. And we're kind of sitting on our hands saying, well, we're not gonna vote against it because we really want to have it. But I don't think any of us want to be sitting here in another 6 months and learn that we have to borrow another $2 million.
No, well,
So it's kind of cart before the horse, I guess.
right, well, we're gonna get, right, we will have certainty in December when we get the tenders back. Right, and you don't have certainty until you get the tenders back. But it takes so damn long to get through this approval process. We've been playing around with it now for a long time, but the next intake from Metro Vancouver, who makes the application through to get it from the province, the next intake for them is in January. Right, so that's the date. If we ever want to build the bloody thing, we've got to make application to them for that intake, but before that, we
You're-
have to
you're
go
stealing
through the
Hope's
whole
presentation.
process. Sorry. Anyway, it's a chicken egg thing, and I'm sure Raj will reassure you that after long and careful deliberation, he's absolutely sure that this should be sufficient. And if not, we have to either design smaller or redesign to fit what we can borrow and push something off till later, or come back to the users with a different number, or come up with something really, really creative.
So are you fairly sure, Raj? I mean, it was a big jump from the last time around.
Sorry, I missed the beginning of that conversation.
How confident are you in the money being asked for in the alternative approval process, that this will be sufficient to cover what the price on the tenders are going to be?
My information is built on information that we've received from WSP, and they've provided us, I believe, 95% confidence in their, or the latest estimate was done at 95% confidence, and we do have a contingency in there, so I have a high level of confidence in those numbers at this point in time.
What sort of percentage contingency, 15?
I believe it was a 10 to 15%.
All right, thank you.
And are there gonna be penalties in for overages in the contract?
No, typically.
When you do get the tender in and they agree to the amount of money and then they go over?
Well,
It's
sometimes you've
a
gotta-
fixed price contract, I
Okay.
believe.
So they can't go over.
Okay.
Yeah, there can be reasons why
You can have
the cost
delays.
would go over, but
The delays for the
it's not an hourly contract, it's definitely fixed
Yeah.
price based on the described scope, but there can be scope changes, and that's why we carry a contingency.
Yeah, the contingency is there
Should
to
cover
cover those possibilities.
Things like, I mean, I've already found some geotechnical issues that have changed design and would likely be part of the cost increases we've seen. Different subsoils in that area that they have to put a large tank on, things like that are unforeseen.
So you'll tell me when I can ask about conservation?
Yeah, we're getting there.
Yeah, we're getting there. Any questions related to the information?
I'm just curious, like, if you compare the city of Vancouver water treatment as like a level 10 and what we currently have as whatever it is, a 3, where does the plan bring us on that scale? Yeah,
Well-
are we getting, just roughly? I know
Metro
it's not
Vancouver
science,
spent
it's
$1
like-
billion on
I
a
know.
filtration plant, and really the treatment that we're looking at provides that same level of
Okay,
filtration.
so
So,
like it's
I mean, you have to think, and one of the topics maybe for the second part of the meeting is the same water quality guidelines that are federally set, that are enacted through or required by Vancouver Coastal Health will be what Metro Van requires as well. So it's not like we have a different water quality guideline that we're trying to meet on island compared to Metro Vancouver.
We hit the number at 500 connections. Over 500 connections, we were bumped up to a higher, this triple, whatever it is, triple redundancy or something it's called, whatever there are, three level protection or whatever. So we're there now. Yeah.
Okay.
Now that we have
Oh,
this
goodness.
new, I think, I believe it's a land acquisition, can we not post signs about people not swimming in the lake? Because this summer, there's been, campers and boats and swimmers. Can there not be a sign that,
Do you want me to take this one too, or do you want to take it?
No, I mean, it's a bit of the second half of the meeting, but I think it's a valid question. So Murray, do you want to get in and?
Yeah, I'll try to make it
Try to
as
respond.
succinct as possible. That's the first thing we did when this committee was reformed and came back, right? And the RCMP came back to us and said, well, we can't. You can't have a municipal bylaw that controls a provincial property, which is the water, right? So we don't have control over the lake just because we have a lease on it that allows us to take water. The way that it would normally be handled is that the property owner who owns all of the land around the lake would ask the police to enforce no trespassing on their property. However, at the time, there was a developer who wanted to set up a ecological reserve on half of the lake and a development on the rest, and was inviting everybody on Bowen Island to please come out and take a look at the lake. And so the last thing he wanted was to instruct the RCMP to arrest anybody that walked on his property, which is what we were asking him to do. And he said, gee, I don't think so. So, and the other thing is, we did a tremendous amount of research on how many watersheds were able to protect their water. And Vancouver is really quite unique. In the rest of the world, there are people swimming and boating and doing every other bloody thing you can imagine on the water.
Well,
That
think
then,
of Okanagan Lake.
yeah, that then goes into the water systems. It's nothing unique about us. And the amount of risk is incredibly small. At our intake, out in the middle of the lake, 22 feet below the surface, we have never had E. coli or,
Knock on wood, Murray.
What's that?
Knock on wood.
Yeah.
I mean,
Today, we've never had anything we couldn't handle that came out of that lake due to human interventions or human use of it.
And to
Well, you
add to
have-
that, I think most of the risk is related to land use in the upper watershed or the mid-island in terms of, small-scale agriculture, sediment loading from development, chicken houses, horses and things like that. That's the true source of potential risk into Grafton Lake. It isn't the swimmers, at least in terms of the relative risk.
Well, this summer there were boaters, and we do have zebra mussels now in BC. And you bring zebra mussels into that lake, and your intakes are having a problem. It is something that we should actually be concerned about, and if we don't have control over it, then the province has control over it. And the province can put up the sign, no swimming, no boating, no camping. I don't think this should be left. That's fine.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, it's obviously a complex issue jurisdictionally. I think that it comes up at least once a year at our local advisory committee meetings. I think obviously the trail around the lake and then Grafton Lands Development will change some of the access, increase access and potentially provide more opportunity to post it and things like that. But I think it's in flux right now.
Yeah. And the other thing to keep in mind is that our system is made to handle that. The ceramic filtration, all the stuff that we're doing should completely eradicate 99.9. I mean, the toughest thing that you want to get rid of is something like Giardia. Very, very small viruses that, and we should be there. Between the filtration, which should do it, the UV, which should do it, and then the rechlorination, which should do it. Between the three of them, it should do it.
But you are aware that Mary's Lake on Salt Spring Island is having a huge issue around
Yeah, no,
their water source, and they're regretting the fact that they never looked after it, and that it's become a free-for-all recreational property.
Yeah.
And we
Not
have
to
a
get
chance to stop.
Yeah, we need to
now
move
we're
it.
getting into the weeds.
Yeah, that's mainly land use driven
Yeah.
rather than recreation driven, but
Yeah.
Hope, I think you were on to give a very brief introduction to the alternative approval process.
Yeah, for sure. For those that have joined and didn't get the introductions, I'm Hope Dallas, I'm the corporate officer with the municipality. I'm in charge of elections and AAPs. So you should have received a notice in your mail. It's also available on our website, notice of AAP. So AAP is an alternative approval process, so an alternative to referendum or other types of elector assent. So that being said, I had a report at the last council meeting. It's included in the agenda package for you to read, and it just determines, it outlines how I determine the number of eligible electors. So that's the electors that will be able to sign an elector response form if they oppose proceeding with Bylaw 488, which is the loan authorization bylaw, which would allow the municipality to borrow the funds needed to pay for our 1/3, that's correct, right? Our 1/3 portion of the construction costs. So that being said, we issued the first notice on September 12th. The second notice will go out today, in today's undercurrent. And so from now, we have 32 days until we can receive the deadline essentially for receiving responses, which is October 21st at 4:30 p.m. So if we receive 119 elector response forms from eligible electors within the Cove area, we cannot proceed with the bylaw, and we will be required to do it at a referendum. If we don't receive 10%, then we can proceed with the bylaw, and council will give it, we'll adopt the bylaw, and we'll proceed with construction. So does anyone have any questions? This is a really high-level overview. I apologize.
What would happen if the system lost the referendum?
That's a very good question. You guys clearly don't want improved water quality, I guess.
It
So
would be unheard of.
it would be.
It would be unheard of.
And it would not be the end of the process. I think it would be a redesign and some reevaluation, but
Or
it doesn't get rid of the requirement for the Bowen Island municipality to upgrade the water treatment plant. So.
But it also would put the 3.8 million government funding that has been provided into uncertainty. They could ask for it back.
Yeah.
So,
In terms of the alternative approval process, I'm not an expert on it, but I did find the BC government website, which provides a sort of policy background and how it works with the Local Government Act, quite clear and very useful. So I put it up on the site here. So if any of you want, again, the background of what it's meant to be used for, why they actually have it as an alternative to referenda, it's a really useful site.
It's used instead of the referendum for things that are almost certain to pass. So if it's being misused, then the electorate can come forward, and if enough of them come forward and say, no, we want this to go to referendum, then it fails. But referendums cost a lot of money, take a lot of time, and this is the inexpensive way of dealing with assent from the electorate.
And as it states on this website, the Local Government Act and Community Charter, they identify which matters can be put to the alternative approval process, including boundary extensions, road authorization bylaw. So they've laid out in that policy and that legislation how and when it can be used. So road authorization is a very clear example of that.
So I'm just going to clarify one point. The municipal contribution will be more than 1/3 now because we're borrowing. It was 1/3 based on the original budget when the project was about $5.8 million, but with the increase in the cost of the project, basically the provincial and federal government are not kicking in any additional funds. Those funds will be made up by the municipality, but we do still have $3.8 million in grant funding for the project.
Any questions on the alternative process? Okay. Any more questions related to the information meeting that people have not asked?
You did, Annette stressed, it's very important that you get signed up, telephone number, email addresses, so that we can send you information if we need to, alerts and all that sort of stuff.
Sign up with school?
You can do it through the website. There is.
I'm signed up for the municipal alerts.
So there is the alerts where you can sign up, but that is not related to any names or addresses or phone numbers. We just have a list of email addresses where we send out alerts and updates. But in order that we can contact you if we detect a leak, then we need to have the permission from you that we can store your information associated with your email or a telephone number. So that is a different.
So could you remind us, I can't remember what the process was. You had an ad in the undercurrent, I think, and I responded with a web address. Is that how?
There are multiple ways that you can go on the website, or you just send us an email indicating your account number, your address, your phone number, and then.
It is a really good idea. I encourage people to do it, but I just don't remember what the process was. There was an easy prompt that I think you had in the undercurrent. And it's not, I'm asking you to remind people what that is, not just look on the website. The website is, for some people, pretty.
Well, you kind of have to look on the website to find an easy prompt.
It's
an easy prompt, if you just look on the bloody website.
I think to say, the website also is not.
Can we get the website up on the screen so we show them what to do?
Oh,
yes.
You want, you want to pull it up on the.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Then you can show your neighbors and friends.
Exactly. I know, it's on the last water bill, and it was a very good place. I remember that.
Right, okay.
Oh.
I believe she just said so.
There it
You can do
I
that.
am.
Supposedly you said that.
Yeah, you can use the link, provide your contact information under help us contact you quickly.
Right.
That is the easiest way to do that and fill out the form that comes up.
So this is probably more relevant to houses that are not occupied.
No, just anybody. Who knows what's going to come up if you had an alert about a boiled water order
Oh, I
or,
see, that
you
kind
know,
of
like
thing. But if
anything.
you discover the leak,
Most
discover the leak as well.
recently, for instance, most recently, somebody had a leak. They weren't here, they got a large overconsumption.
Yeah.
And they didn't understand. And we tried to contact them, but we weren't able to get in contact with them because they were off island, all we had was their residential address. So this just allows us to get in touch, more ways of
Quickly.
contacting, yeah.
It's called the 21st century. We just are kind of moving forward from, the Pony Express thing to actually emailing people, because people say, you could just email. What a good idea. Just give us your email address and we will.
Okay, I think we'll end the information meeting now. We will now transition to the local advisory committee meeting. Only Murray and I are members of the public, so we will not have quorum for this meeting, which allows, so we will not be able to